Now we're going to have Professor Samantha Moore-Berg. She's the director of the Peace and Conflict Neuroscience Lab. She also has her PhD in psychology and has done tons of work all over the world. And now we're going to have her presentation. So welcome, Samantha.
Hi there, thank you for having me here today. I am going to share my screen and hope that this works. 1 minute. It's always so stressful doing these things live. Should have pulled it up first. Okay, sorry. If I share here. Okay, so you can see it, but then you can see all my slides, right? Okay. We good? You can see it? Okay, I think.
Yeah, it's there.
So thank you all for having me here today. I'm really excited to present some research that I conducted with Emil on looking at the effect of intergroup contact on dehumanization and meta-dehumanization. So when you turn on the news, it's likely that you might see some fighting between various groups. And this fighting that happens might happen because of intolerance or political ideological differences that occur between various groups. So for instance, in the United States, we see that Democrats and Republicans, which are the two major political groups, fight over the type of immigrants that should be allowed to enter into the United States and what privileges these immigrants should be allowed to have once they get here. In Nigeria, we see fighting that's rooted in deep religious intolerance between Christians and Muslims that has a lot of historical relevance to it. We see across Europe that there's also religious intolerance, specifically about Muslims. And we see in Israel that there's deep fighting between Israelis and Palestinians that's rooted in desire for political power and also land rights. And these are some of the topics that I look at in my research, and in particular that we look at in the Peace and Conflict Neuroscience Lab. So what is the Peace and Conflict Neuroscience Lab? This lab was founded at the University of Pennsylvania by Emil Bruno, and I was really fortunate to be one of the postdocs that worked in this lab along with Boaz Hemeri. And it was really founded on this premise of putting science to work for peace, and specifically understanding how the human mind can drive intergroup conflict and how we can use neuroscience insights and psychological insights to understand conflict and then intervene on conflict. And we oftentimes do this by partnering with different nonprofit organizations in order to make sure that the research we're conducting has maximum impact in various communities. And we also partner with the communities themselves to make sure that the research questions that we're tackling are relevant, that they're sensitive to the needs of the communities, and that we're actually doing good in those communities and the societies. And so there's two different lines of works that we focus on in the Peace and Conflict Neuroscience Lab, and that I do in my research as well. So this first line of work is what drives intergroup conflict and discrimination. And then once we understand this, what drives intergroup conflict, what can we do to reduce intergroup conflict? And so to give you a brief overview of a lot of the research that I'm sure you all know that Emil conducted and that I have since kind of carried on the torch to conduct as well. A lot of the things we look at have to do with dehumanization, or how you think other people are less than human, especially those that you're in conflict with. We look at empathetic failures, or how we might feel less empathy towards various groups that we disagree with or we dislike. And we look at this concept called collective blame, where we tend to blame whole groups for the actions of an individual few if they're outgroup members, but we typically do not associate the same amount of blame with our group. If our group commits an act of hate or an act of violence, we assume that it's just a couple of people and not the entire group, but we don't have the same courtesy for outgroup members. And there's three types of interventions that we focus on in the lab to reduce conflict and discrimination. One is changing meta-perceptions. Meta-perceptions are assumptions that we make about what others think about us and our group. We focus on intergroup contact interventions, or how bringing people together can help ameliorate some of the conflict and animosity that happens between two groups. And we focus on educational and media interventions, where we try to scale up the interventions we do in the lab in various mass media campaigns, which Boaz and Rebecca also touched on earlier. That is some stuff we do in our lab as well, and really was rooted in the philosophy of Emile Bruno, really putting science to work for peace, understanding conflict, and then intervening on it with peace-building interventions. So today I'm going to focus on a couple of these topics in my research presentation. So first is dehumanization, understanding what people think about dehumanization, how it can be rooted in conflict, and then specifically what we can do to intervene on dehumanization. And we can focus on this by changing our meta-perceptions, again, what we think others think about us, and through intergroup contact interventions. Dehumanizing language about various outgroups has long permeated the media and public discourse. I briefly touched on a couple of examples in the beginning about what types of conflict might lead to dehumanization, but to provide a couple of other examples, we see, especially with the coronavirus pandemic, that there's a lot of blame placed on Chinese people, saying that they're viruses, equating them with virus, illness, and saying they're to blame for this pandemic worldwide. So using dehumanizing terms to talk about Chinese people. We see similar dehumanizing language to describe immigrants, and this happens all over the United States. It's not unique to one sort of place. When immigrants are entering the country, people might use dehumanizing terms and language and dehumanize a group in order to justify keeping them out of society. People might say they bring in diseases, that they're here to incite violence, that they're here to take the privileges and advantages away from the host society, to suck up resources. So really saying that these people are not worthy of being here because they lack the human traits that are necessary to be civil within society. And then also deep-rooted in many different societies across the globe is racism. And people, again, use dehumanizing language to describe different races, which can lead to various harmful consequences. So it can lead to segregation by having one group of people be allowed different privileges and another group of people, and keeping them physically separated from those who are in power or who are the majority group. It can lead to war, just using dehumanizing language again to justify war on certain groups of people, and it can even lead to genocide. So dehumanization has been long rooted in history and can have very severe consequences for different groups of people. Now, meta-dehumanization is similar to dehumanization. We're still talking about people who are less than human, or our perceptions of people who are less than humans, except this is rooted in what you think others think about you. So think of a group that you're not a part of and make an assumption about what they think about you and your group. It might not be super positive. And in fact, we see this process of meta-dehumanization happening in many different places. So one particular area of meta-dehumanization that I've focused on recently is in the United States, looking at Democrats and Republicans. Democrats and Republicans are the two major political parties, and Republicans are typically represented with an elephant logo, and Democrats are typically represented with a donkey logo. And we can see when we ask Democrats and Republicans how much you dehumanize the other political party, we see that they're pretty even. So in this top graph with the red, we see that Republicans have about a 22-point bias between how much they dehumanize their in-group, their fellow Republicans, and how much they dehumanize the out-group, or Democrats. And if you look at the bottom graph, which is Democrats, we see Democrats have the same pattern of results, where they have about a 22-point difference in how much they dehumanize their in-group versus their out-group. Yet when we ask them about perceived bias, how much they think the other political party dehumanizes their in-group versus out-group, we see that both Democrats and Republicans greatly overestimate what they think the other side thinks about them. So on the top graph, which has the little donkey with the elephant speech bubble, we see that Democrats think Republicans would have about a 55-point difference in how much they rate Republicans versus Democrats, when in fact the difference, as we saw, is 22 points. Similarly, Republicans think that there's a 59-point difference in how much they think Democrats would humanize their own group versus the other group. And as you might recall, the difference is actually 22 points. So there's a big discrepancy in how much we think the other side dehumanizes us and how much actual dehumanization exists. Just like with dehumanization, there are various consequences of meta-dehumanization as well. So again, leaving people out of society or excluding people from society, preventing certain religions from expressing their religion within society, and again, limiting the rights and freedoms of various groups. So one question that we often ask is, what can we do to counteract dehumanization and meta-dehumanization? Given the dire consequences of both psychological processes, we wonder whether or not we can actually counteract it to improve intergroup relationships. And one potential way that we can improve our intergroup relations by reducing dehumanization and meta-dehumanization is with intergroup contact. Intergroup contact is simply bringing people together, and it can actually be very effective at reducing conflict if it's marked by a positive encounter. So if the situation is going well, people might then extrapolate that contact with the other person to the entire group as a whole and reduce dehumanization towards the entire group if the interaction is marked by a positive experience. And there's two processes that are important or that we looked at looking at intergroup contact. So you can look at contact quantity, or how often you come into contact with another group of people, versus contact quality, or how good or poor the interaction is. And both features are important to intergroup contact and are two things that we measured in the current research. So in the current studies, we were curious about the relationship between intergroup contact, dehumanization, and meta-dehumanization. And specifically, we hypothesized that as contact increases in quality, and we thought quantity as well, then there will be this reduction in dehumanization and meta-dehumanization. So a link between our contact and our reducing of intergroup conflict through dehumanization and meta-dehumanization. In the first study, we collected data from 5 different countries across various different outgroups. These outgroups were specific to the country context, and I have a slide in a moment that talks about how the outgroups we looked at. And in the study, there is about 5,300 participants, and this data was collected in the United States, in Greece, Spain, Hungary, and Israel. We asked 2 questions to get at dehumanization. This first was actually developed by Emil himself, and it's called the Ascent of Human Scale. And what participants do is they rate how human or evolved and civilized the outgroup is on this sliding scale. We also asked people to rate the outgroup on various terms, such as savage, aggressive, primitive, barbaric, and lacking morals. And what we did was we averaged scores on this multi-item scale with the Ascent of Human Scale to create an overall composite score. But importantly, for meta-dehumanization, we just used the Ascent of Human score to ask meta-dehumanization questions, which was the same scale as I just previously showed, except this time you're saying what you think the outgroup would say about you and your in-group. We then asked 2 questions about contact. So first, we asked about contact quality. We asked them when they have contact with the target group, how pleasant do they find the contact to be? And this is a scale ranging from very unpleasant to very pleasant. To assess contact quantity, we asked them to indicate how regularly they come into contact with the outgroup, ranging from very infrequently to very frequently. So then, as I mentioned, we assessed the outgroup was based on the country context. And so in the United States, we assessed attitudes about welfare recipients, Iranians, Native Americans, and Mexican Americans. And this first table is for dehumanization scores. And we see that consistently contact quality is associated with reducing dehumanization. So as contact quality improves, dehumanization decreases. And you can see, looking at the contact quantity column, that this pattern isn't as consistent. There's only one instance where contact quantity predicts a reduction in dehumanization. In Greece, we measured attitudes about the Roma, and again, we see that as contact quality improves, dehumanization decreases. Similar pattern in Spain, measuring attitudes about the Roma. Similar pattern in Hungary, again, measuring attitudes about the Roma and Muslim refugees. And then also in Israel, about attitudes about Palestinians. So across all these different contexts, across all these different target groups, we see that as contact quality improves, dehumanization decreases. Then looking at meta-dehumanization, for meta-dehumanization, we had a smaller subscale of groups that we assessed. So we asked in the United States, we looked specifically at Iranians, and we see that as contact quality improves, meta-dehumanization decreases. Similar pattern of results in Spain, looking at the target group of Roma. Similar pattern of results in Hungary, looking at the target group of Roma and Muslim refugees. And similar pattern of results in Israel, looking at Palestinians. So again, as contact quality improves, meta-dehumanization decreases. So our perceptions about what they think of us, how we think they dehumanize us, actually gets better. And we think that they dehumanize us less, the more better contact we have with the outgroup. We then conducted a longitudinal assessment to determine whether or not positive contact quality and quantity predicts attitudes over time. And we included here dehumanization, meta-dehumanization, and contact measures that I previously discussed. And what we see here is that contact quality does, in fact, predict reductions in meta-dehumanization and dehumanization over time. And this isn't the same for contact quantity. We don't see that there is this over time prediction. And this is true when we control for prejudice, meta-prejudice, political affiliation. We see that again, this time one measure, contact quality and contact quantity, predicts a reduction in dehumanization and meta-dehumanization 6 months later at time 2. And I should mention that this was among a US sample. With these first two studies that I talked about, they're both correlational. So we asked people questions and we correlated these responses with the dehumanization and meta-dehumanization scores. But what these studies are limited in is that they don't measure actual contact. And so what we did was we partnered with the non-governmental organization SOLIA, a nonprofit based in the United States and in the Middle East and North Africa, to assess and evaluate the virtual contact program that they put together. And what SOLIA does is that it brings students together, college students who are located in the United States and also who are located in the Middle East and North Africa. So in this study, there's 325 participants in the SOLIA program. And the data that I'll show you is specifically about the United States college students' attitudes. And there's 38 people in the control group. What the control group was, it was a waitlist control group, where it's people who are taking similar classes to those involved in the experimental group, but who weren't actually in the SOLIA program. To tell you a little bit more about the SOLIA program, what they do is they bring together college students over the course of a semester through various interactions. The students engage in a 2-hour virtual exchange, again, over the course of an entire semester. And these exchanges are marked by swapping stories about their lives, working on a collaborative media engagement project, and really just learning about the other group. So really the overall context of the 2 hours during the week are marked by positive intergroup interaction. So what we did was we assessed dehumanization and meta-dehumanization before the program began and then after the program closed. And we did this for both the experimental group and the control group. And the dehumanization and meta-dehumanization questions that we asked were the same as the ones that I previously showed you. So what we see in this pre-program is that there really isn't a difference in how much the experimental group and the control group rate dehumanization levels. So both groups are pretty similar. But when we assess attitudes after the program ended, we see there's a pretty big difference in the control group and the virtual contact group. So those who are involved in the SOLIA group and the SOLIA program showed a reduction in dehumanization towards the outgroup. So specifically reduction in dehumanization towards the students who are in the Middle East and North Africa and towards Muslims in general. With meta-dehumanization, we see a similar pattern of results where there really isn't much difference in meta-dehumanization at the pre-program, but there is a marginally significant difference in the post-program, that those who were engaged in the virtual contact program saw a reduction in meta-dehumanization as compared to the control. And importantly, the effect within group, so within the experimental group, before and after the program was significant. So within group, we saw again that there is this decrease in dehumanization and meta-dehumanization before and after taking the program. So what these results suggest is that positive contact reduces dehumanization of the outgroup and meta-dehumanization of the outgroup. And positive contact in general can be a really important avenue to improving intergroup relations. And specifically, contact that's marked by really positive exposure and really powerful positive intergroup interactions can lead to this reduction in intergroup conflict, even beyond how frequently you engage with the outgroup. And with that, I want to thank my collaborators who worked on this project, Emile Bruno, Boaz Mary, and Norka Taylor. And I'm happy to answer questions later, and then you can follow up over email with me as well. So thank you for having me here today.